Rothbard argued, to the contrary, that the distinction between a monopoly price and a competitive price was conceptually meaningless in a free market economy. Now, Mises was once asked his opinion of Rothbard's disagreement with his theory of monopoly price by Joaquin Rieg, the Spanish translator of Human Action. This occurred at the Mont Pelerin Society meeting in 1965. Margit von Mises said that her husband had replied, quote, "Whatever Rothbard has written in this work is of the greatest importance," unquote. However, the Spanish economist Jesus Huerta de Soto has reported that when Rieg himself used to recount this incident, he would quote Mises' response as, quote, "I agree with every word Professor Rothbard has written on the subject," unquote. Whichever account of the incident is correct, the point is that even in his later years, Mises remained open to the criticisms of his students when they improved upon his own work. Rothbard, too, treated his mentor and his predecessors in economics with uncommon deference and respect. He often referred to himself only as a student of Mises and characterized his own original contributions to economics as attempts to advance what he called the Misesian paradigm. The first time Rothbard ever directly criticized Mises in public was in his classic paper on praxeology, value judgments, and public policy, which he presented at the North American Conference on Austrian Economics, the first North American Conference on Austrian Economics, held in South Royalton, Vermont. The year was 1974, and Rothbard was already nearly 50 years old. He was already a prolific author and one of the most accomplished and recognized Austrian economists in the world besides Hayek. Yet, after his talk ended, I remember him confiding to a few of us in attendance that he was still a little shaky, unsettled, or disturbed from having criticized his mentor publicly for the first time. What Rothbard had done in this paper, correctly in my judgment, was to point out that Mises' utilitarian social philosophy was incapable of supporting value-free judgments about the effects of economic policies on social welfare. Rothbard did not simply dismiss or ridicule Mises' position, but subjected it to the careful scrutiny and analysis that a great scholar's work is entitled to. I was fortunate to count Murray Rothbard as a close friend for over 20 years. So perhaps you will indulge me some personal recollections that reveal his great intellectual humility and his respect for his younger followers like myself. Some may have called us little punks. On one occasion, I met Murray for a lunch at his favorite delicatessen in New York City. It was in the early 1990s when he was working on his 2-volume masterpiece on the history of economic thought. Over lunch, he eagerly told me about the many new discoveries he had made, the unjustly obscure economists he had discovered, how one apparently minor economist was actually a brilliant movement organizer, although his influence was evil, as Murray would say, how modern psychobabble, which Rothbard usually detested, was actually useful in explaining the thought of a famous classical economist. And on he went, in his rapid-fire New York style of speaking. He gleefully told me about the novel interpretations and critiques he was developing that would puncture the overblown reputations of some of the most venerable figures in economic thought. While he spoke, I rarely said anything because I was fascinated by what I was learning and I wanted to absorb every new idea and insight. I was also stunned by the breadth and the depth of his knowledge about a subject that he had not previously written much on. He must have mistaken my silence as a sign of boredom, because after about an hour, he suddenly stopped and sheepishly apologized for going on at such length. I assured him that I was not bored and urged him to continue. To my delight, he merrily resumed his discourse for another 2 hours. Later, I thought to myself, how could he think that I ever would want to interrupt him? Here he was, a creative genius who was giving me a private seminar on a work in progress that was sure to be a future classic when it was published. I will relate one more personal memory. In 1990, I published an article entitled Ludwig von Mises as a Social Rationalist in the Review of Economics, a journal edited by Rothbard. The article presented an interpretation of Mises' views on the problem of socialist calculation and on the function of the price system, which differed radically from the common interpretation held by leading Austrian economists, including Israel Kirzner and to some extent Rothbard himself. In particular, I argue that Mises' position in the socialist calculation debate and his understanding of the function of the price system differed significantly from his student Hayek's. I withheld the paper for about 6 months after it was completed because I was fearful of how it would be received. I finally sent it to Rothbard, and to my great relief, he responded quickly with a long letter highly praising the paper. Here is part of what he wrote. And I quote this because he's written very similar letters to many younger scholars. It's a wonderful, superb advance and breakthrough, not only in the history of economic thought, but also in economic theory itself. Reading the article was just a joy. In a sense, this sort of breakthrough experience is something like the joy of an intellectual conversion on reading libertarian stuff or Austrian economics for the first time, where the person develops your own feelings. And so I felt for a long time that Hayek and Hayekianism was on the wrong track, but I have never been able to articulate it. You've done it. Unquote. Rothbard concluded this letter by perfectly summarizing the attitude that a vocational economist takes toward new ideas, even when these ideas come from a younger scholar of much less significance and accomplishment. Wrote Rothbard, I welcome change and advances in Austrian theory, provided they are true, that they work from within the basic Misesian paradigm. Just as I think that I advanced beyond Mises in developing the Misesian paradigm, people like Hans Hoppe and yourself have developed the paradigm still further and great. Unquote. The point is, I was not alone in receiving such enthusiastic words of encouragement from Rothbard, who was always eager to recognize the author of even a modest contribution to the search for truth. And you did not have to be a card-carrying Austrian to receive such effusive praise from Rothbard. Murray welcomed and published many papers by fellow travelers and non-Austrians who contributed to the advancement of Austrian scholarship. With respect for tradition, the respect for tradition that characterized Mises and Rothbard was motivated by their pursuit of truth. The sciences, and especially the social sciences, do not progress in linear fashion, smoothly discarding erroneous conceptions and theories and replacing them with new truths about reality. The history of economic thought is marked by misleading detours, dead ends, and prolonged periods of retrogression away from the truth. That is why Mises and Rothbard treated the history of thought as a living part of economic science. It was an essential part of their mental equipment in the process of conceiving sound new theories. And let me give you a few examples. Mises formulated his theory of the business cycle by integrating contributions from a diverse group of his predecessors. These included the theory of the international specie flow mechanism originated by Hume and Ricardo, the business cycle theory outlined by the mid-19th century British currency school, the distinction between the natural and loan rates of interest developed by the Swedish economist Wicksell, and finally, the capital and interest theory of his own teacher, Bombaverk. Even Mises' boldest departures from received economic theory and method were stimulated by the thinking of past economists. Take, for example, Mises' argument that economics is a science of human action based on a priori, that is, non-experimental reasoning. Mises credited the work of several generations of scholars in which this view was more or less developed. He mentioned by name many completely different thinkers. The classical economists, Nassau Sr., Cairns, and John Stuart Mill. The British banker and essayist, Walter Bagehot. The Austrian economists, Menger and Friedrich von Wieser. The sociologist, Max Weber. and Mises' own contemporary Lionel Robbins of the London School of Economics. We also have the example of the step-by-step method that Mises applied to analyzing the effects of increases in the supply of money on prices and incomes. This analysis led Mises to the radical conclusion that Irving Fisher and other contemporary supporters of the neoclassical quantity theory were incorrect in claiming that a change in the supply of money, all other things equal, leads to a direct and proportional change of the price level. Using his step-by-step method, Mises demonstrated beyond doubt that a change in the money supply causes prices of different goods to change at different times and unevenly, and therefore causes redistributions of income and wealth, and then changes in the pattern of the demands for various goods and services. Thus, a change in the money supply could not possibly cause all prices to change at the same time in the same proportion. But Mises' theory was not completely new. He credited the classical economist J.E. Cairns for having outlined in 1873 the step-by-step process by which the discovery of new gold mines in Australia brought about permanent redistributions of income and changes in relative prices internationally. This occurred as the new gold flowed through international balances of payments of first one country and then the next, and affected the money supply of these countries at different times and in different order. And long before Cairns wrote, Richard Cantillon used the same method to analyze the effects of changes in the money supply in a treatise that he published in 1755, and a treatise which Mises was familiar with. Many of Rothbard's advances in economic theory were also founded on past contributions in the literature. Possibly the most important contribution of Man, Economy, and State is the comprehensive theory of production that covers 5 chapters and 300 pages. While writing this treatise, Rothbard had discovered that he had to reconstruct Austrian production theory. In a progress report on his treatise that he wrote to the people that were funding him, he wrote the following: Mises has very little detail on production theory, unquote. Rothbard developed his theory by integrating the structure of production analysis developed by Wicksell and Hayek with the pure time preference theory of Mises and Frank Fetter. Both of these lines of thought originated in Bombawerk. However, in Human Action, Mises had ignored structure of production analysis, presumably because of its association with Bombawerk's fallacious notion of a measurable average period of production. Rothbard searched the contemporary literature for new ideas and insights as carefully as he had scrutinized the writings of his predecessors. Man, Economy, and State contains citations of over 150 books, journals, conference proceedings, government reports, dissertations, policy reports, and monographs that appeared between 1949, when Human Action was written, and 1962, when Man, Economy, and State was published. Rothbard's deep engagement with the contemporary literature paid off as he discovered that many of these works contained ideas that helped him to clarify, correct, and advance Austrian theory. And he eagerly integrated these contributions into his own work. So he did not just depend on past Austrians. One example is his critique, or another example is his critique of perfect competition and monopolistic competition doctrines, and his formulation of a positive theory of competition as a dynamic process. Here, Rothbard favorably cited the contributions of a number of mainstream economists. He singled out a book on quality and competition written by an obscure economist, Lawrence Abbott, and he gave this book special praise. He characterized it as, quote, one of the outstanding theoretical works of recent years. Indeed, the theory of rivalrous competition developed by Rothbard is clearly influenced by Abbott's arguments on the central importance of the qualitative dimensions of competition.